Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. This week, I am speaking with Sam Husseini, the Palestinian-American journalist and media critic who has formulated the Vote Pact strategy that offers third-party voters a small d democratic method of casting a third-party ballot while simultaneously nullifying arguments about third-party spoilers who deliver a victory to the so-called greater evil as opposed to the so-called lesser evil. This comes in light of a recent open letter published by a number of progressive left websites featuring signatories such as Noam Chomsky, Bill Fletcher, Kathy Kelly, Norman Solomon, Michael Albert, and several others calling for Green Party presidential candidate Howie Hawkins to adopt a, quote, safe states strategy that would limit his campaign from activity in swing states. For a further context of this matter, consider these facts. It has been known for years now by social scientists that the vast majority of American voters agree upon a significant number of policy goals despite party affiliation, such as opposition to war and the too-big-to-fail banking paradigm. In 2014, Ralph Nader described 25 different instances of this in his book Unstoppable, the Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. In 2010, a number of anti-war groups spanning the political spectrum gathered at a conference in Washington to contemplate the issue. However, it was the eloquent Glen Ford of Black Agenda Report who articulated some months later the flaws in what otherwise seems a political match made in heaven.
Hi. I feel kind of funny because I like Kevin Z's. And Kevin Z's is the reason we're having this meeting this morning. I think that essentially what we're being asked to do here is to make nice with what is essentially a racist movement. One has conflicting feelings. It was more than 40 years ago that black folks in the movement, not all but some, asked white people to go forth among other white people and try to civilize them. And that should be a part of that mission, not doing missionary work with black folks, but civilizing their own folks. And although it was a very painful period then, it basically became a consensus and a settled deal. So how can I stand up here and tell Kevin Zeese that he should not be going forth and civilizing his people? That's difficult for me to do, and of course I can't do it. So I guess what we should be really talking about is what is the nature of this Tea Party and what are the political ramifications should the anti-war movement be seen as making nice with the Tea Party. What is the cost here? And I am saying that the cost is we at Black is Back, and not just Black is Back, but black organizations across the board would have to disassociate ourselves from a movement that seemed like it was making nice to what is in fact another manifestation of white nationalism. There is nothing new about the Tea Party. It is as old as dirt. We speak in euphemisms in this country, euphemisms like the word populism. I don't know what that means. I do know that the dominant ideology of this country in its founding and up until very recently was white nationalism, white supremacy, and it was quite popular. So is that populism? And that it is still in play. We are even familiar with the Populist Party, which was quite active in the South, in my ancestral homeland of Georgia. And there were, for a time, some great successes in collaboration between blacks, almost entirely in the Republican Party, and white folks in the Populist Party. But we saw that that great experiment collapsed in the face of white nationalism, and that white populists, the greatest example being Tom Watson in Georgia, soon began scapegoating black people for their failures to get the kind of transformational changes that they would like. And they spawned a whole generation of fire-breathing racists like Vardaman and Bilbo and, yes, George Wallace and Strom Thurmond. That is the legacy of a failed populist party. And it failed because it was essentially a white nationalist movement. They could not be sustained. So we have this in our history. Is the Tea Party somehow different because it is at times it at times appears to be operating outside of the Republican Party? Is that some kind of phenomenon that should make it an exception from just your garden variety, resurgent white nationalism and reaction? Well, the Dixiecrats in 1948, that was when the Hubert Humphrey gave a speech before the Democratic National Convention in Minneapolis in favor of a civil rights plank. The Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond, bolted from the party and carried several states in that election. The Democrats spent 10 years trying to get back and keep the Dixiecrats, you see. So that was outside of the Democratic Party apparatus. Would you call that populism? They were quite popular. They carried those states. But we know it and recognize it today, with nobody arguing, as being a white racist, white nationalist reaction. Why is the Tea Party somehow seen to be something different, something that we can somehow change from its true nature, which is just another recurrent white nationalist reaction to perception among white folks that this country is in danger of not being a white man's country. Now, we could talk all day about the nature of the Tea Party, but I wanted to address what an appearance by the predominantly white anti-war movement of coalescing with those white nationalists would mean in terms of creating what everybody here at this conference has called for, which is a more inclusive anti-war movement. That would be death. This is poison. You would be writing off Black America, playing into the hands of the more right-wing tendencies in Black America, the tendencies that want to rally around President Obama in opposition to the Tea Party, and would brand those of us on the left as collaborators with what every black person knows is the enemy, that same old as dirt enemy in the Tea Party. So this is a suicidal kind of venture. We could talk, as I said, all day, going back in history about the different clothes that white nationalism puts on as it rears its head. But the immediate consequences of going along with my friend's proposal that we coalesce with these white nationalists is that you write off Black America immediately. I don't speak for Hispanics. I kind of think it would be the same deal. Thank you.
That audio was extracted from a video recorded by Stan Heller. With these things in mind, it is worth emphasizing here that Vote Pact offers an opportunity for political education and civilization of white folks who otherwise would be appealed to by racist sentiments, a point we discuss in this interview now. Sam, we have seen this month the release of what is now a rather predictable and at this point almost standard notice that it is essential for people on the left to vote for the Democrats instead of the third party. And one of the things that I've always found intriguing about your Vote Pact proposition is that it enables people to not only take on the opportunity to vote for a third party, but also divert a vote away from the opposing party. So what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, just to frame this, the Vote Pact strategy that I've advocated for many years now is basically a disenchanted, for lack of a better term, disenchanted Democrat and disenchanted Republican team up and both vote for the third parties of their choice rather than canceling out each other. One voting for a Democratic nominee that they don't believe in, and the Republican voting for a Republican nominee that they really don't believe in because they hate or despise the other one more. So this way you're siphoning off pairs in pairs from the establishment party to independent candidates or third parties. They could be the same candidate or different candidates. So take a concrete case. Instead of a vote going to the Democrats, it could go to the Greens. Instead of a vote going to the Republicans, it could go to the Libertarian. The crux of this is it's done either by people who connect on the internet or, more properly, people who know and trust each other. A husband, wife, neighbors, friends, relatives, debating buddies, whatever. That's the solution that I've come up with to get around this problem of people feeling like they agree with, say, the Green Party on the issues, but feel compelled to vote Democrat because they despise Bush or Trump or whoever the Republican nominee is. And you're absolutely right. This is sort of predictable that you have, people who, many of whom I respect and have worked enormously with, very productively with, but the Green Party, I think that I should criticize the Green Party some as well. They seem impervious to the notion that in some instances, some members of the Green Party, certainly not all, sometimes seem impervious or denying of the notion that something that they do could end up or has ended up swinging an election to a Republican. Which, presumably, at least in some cases, they would deem worse than the Democratic alternative. I would certainly credit the Green Party for a lot of things, stance on the issues, noting how neoliberalism and right-wing tendencies work hand in glove in many ways, and so on and so forth. But some Greens were just like, okay, Trump's going to lose, no need to vote for Clinton. And just on a factual basis, that was wrong in 2016. Of course, they weren't the only ones saying that Trump was definitely going to lose, but they did fall into that, or some of them did. But this attack by some people, Noam Chomsky was the most prominent person who signed on to this recent letter. Especially at this time, the letter seems odd because it's effectively, while agreeing with the Green Party in some ways, effectively kneecapping them as a lever in the upcoming election. Now, the great competition, and I think it's somewhat misleading and perhaps a detrimental thing, but the fact of the matter is the big question on a lot of people's minds is who's more likely to beat Trump of the people campaigning for the Democratic Party nomination. And I suspect, I more than suspect, I'm quite sure that virtually all of the letter signers of this letter are either tacitly or overtly endorsing Bernie Sanders. Well, to at this point undermine the relevance of the Green Party in the outcome of the 2020 election would seem to effectively be doing Joe Biden's work for him. That is, you're minimizing the leverage of somebody like Sanders to argue that he's more electable because if he's the Democratic nominee, you'll have more progressives voting for him than you will for the Green Party or any other progressive third party run. So just on a tactical level, I don't understand the timing of this critique of the Green Party at this time. And it's very odd to me that neither the Green Party nor the letter signers here are contemplating a Vote Pact type strategy, so that they're in effect making their tactical differences trump their massive political agreement in terms of policies and so on with each other. So their inability to make a vote pact among themselves, so to speak, their inability to come up with a broader, cohesive strategy like the one I've advocated, in effect means that we've had, I would say, I guess at least 5 and maybe more of presidential election cycles, meaning we're above 2 decades at this point, where this feud has gone on. And it's allowing the policy agreement to be sidetracked by this tactical disagreement because there's no underlying cohesive strategy or, as far as I can tell, a meaningful dialogue going on here.
And simultaneous with that, the tactical agreement between the Democrats and the Republicans to push the country farther to the right is allowed to go further as a result.
They're brilliant at appearing to be fighting, but actually working hand in glove. Mm-hmm. Whether that's militarizing foreign policy, Democrats pretending to be anti-Trump when they're actually juicing up more aggressive foreign policies, when they're juicing up or distracting from things that are leading to more economic inequality and class warfare against poor people and so on, a whole plethora of policies. They work together very nicely while attempting to fight, while pretending to fight. And so, there are disagreements, but they're generally, I think, calculated to keep the voters from deviating from backing the one or the other of the establishment parties.
I think the most important thing that I saw in the 2016 period was the Clinton speeches to Goldman Sachs, where she came out and said she would support privatizing Social Security. And basically, at that point, the difference between her and George W. Bush is a matter of rhetoric. And in fact, Obama and Clinton are able to pull much more successful strategy about privatizing Social Security and other so-called entitlement welfare state programs because they're slicker at it.
One dynamic is that they are slicker at it. What Glen Ford refers to Obama as the more effective evil.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I tend to look at it as, you know, the Republican stomach acidifies and the Democratic intestines absorb. That is, they're sort of different parts of the same system. So it's left to Republicans to do the hyper brash things, invading Iraq, Trump making the Jerusalem move. These are, you know, things that Democrats helped with, like Joe Biden helped, you know, massively to set the stage for the invasion of Iraq. Democratic officials have for years pushed towards moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, but it sort of takes a Republican president with some level of buffoonery and, you know, perhaps the rest of the establishment can sort of wash their hands of it, of the messiness of how it's done, to actually pull the trigger on those kinds of policies. So I tend to view it as a more symbiotic relationship rather than arguing they're necessarily identical in any genuine way.
So one topic that arises persistently when I bring this conversation of Vote Pact up with people, particularly those on the left, is the matter of what boils down to political education, and particularly in this political landscape, there's a lot of people on the left who have become quite adverse to even the notion that they are friends or relatives with Trump voters, let alone having a social interaction with them where they would make any kind of agreement. And political education is important, I think. And that's a factor that I thought Ralph Nader made a very good stab at with his book Unstoppable, but he didn't really confront totally the issue of how racism has effectively divided people who agree on everything else.
Mm-hmm. Unstoppable was a book by Nader that was sort of about a left-right agreement. Mm-hmm. Although it notably doesn't mention Vote Pact, although Nader has mentioned it irregularly as a voting strategy. You know, I think we have a hate-driven political system, and that's escalated since Trump has become president. And you know, as sappy as it sounds, I actually believe in a lot of things that Martin Luther King said, and the only thing that Trump's hate is love. And people, you know, Hillary Clinton fans, you know, have placards that say that about Trump. Trump loved Trump's hate, but I don't think they believe it. You know, I mean, that means not hating Trump supporters. You know, if we're going to ask, you know, Trump and the U.S. establishment to not hate the Iranian leadership, or Netanyahu to not hate Hamas, how can alleged progressive go around hating Trump supporters? Cliche, you know, you can love the sinner and hate the sin, but you know, you should be able to. How else is this country going to meaningfully change? Yeah, there are going to be major political events and so on, but it's mostly going to change by people dialoguing, particularly dialoguing with people they disagree with. And I think that there are niches that it's difficult. For example, in African American, a lot of, you know, that there are, you know, in the African American community, if somebody is an African American and lives in that community and most of their associates are, then it's difficult for them to necessarily have a meaningful relationship with a Trump supporter. But I mean, me as an Arab American, I end up, at a, table at my mom's house with her friends there who are Trump supporters, in part because they thought that Trump would support the Christians in Syria, which, was, because they took him at his word in terms of being a non-interventionist.
Okay.
So I think that people, the lack of association is at times self-imposed. That is, or you just, you get the vibe that you disagree with this person politically, so you avoid talking about it instead of having the maturity level to find a way to talk about it in a civil way. And ultimately, if you really try to do something like a vote pact in a productive way, again, instead of you canceling out your vote with a Republican, you both vote for something that you believe in more. And that's where you want to get to if you can. And I think it's possible with that dialogue.
Right. And I think that if one looks at the electorate and the landscape of how our current economy and housing markets and everything else are constructed on this settler colonial social contract, it's very difficult for white progressives to be able to say they don't know at least one person in their family that's a Trump voter. I think that's a very rare occurrence.
Yeah, I think so too. And even in the Latino community, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but because of the abortion issue, that there are probably a fair number of Latino Republican votes out there, even with Trump's massive assaults on immigrant communities. But yeah, I think that holds largely for a lot of whites. And I mean, some people say, well, you should push for instant runoff vote or ranked choice voting, which lets you rank voters, which lets you rank candidates 1, 2, 3, or score voting, which lets you, say, 100 points for this one, 80 points for this one, 3 points for this one, whatever. And I've done a lot to promote those kinds of things through my day job at accuracy.org. But, other than citizen initiatives like in Maine, where those things get through, you're kind of asking the political system to write its own death warrant, potentially. It's extremely unlikely. That the advantage of Vote Pact, there are a couple. It's do it yourself, or rather do it yourselves. That is, you don't need the government's permission to vote this way. You just need to find a quote unquote Republican who you can trust. And it also is the basis for dialogue, so that you're actually cooperating with somebody that you disagree with. And I think that it empowers citizens to, flex that muscle. That's what we're always saying we want our so-called leaders to do, right? Different nation states leaders have different interests, but we want them to work together to, help avert, climate disaster and war and other catastrophes and so on. Well, we need to be able to work with people we disagree with in order to achieve a better outcome for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So you previously actually exchanged correspondence with Dr. Chomsky about Vote Pact. I'm wondering if you could share some insights about his thoughts.
I haven't looked at those in a while. He kind of just, dismissed, I was, advocating that he team up with a noted, right-wing academic. I tried to pair people up to some extent. Susan Sarandon, could team up with somebody like Clint Eastwood, and you could have sort of celebrity pairs that if there was a campaign like this of a united candidate, for example, some combination of Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, or perhaps a joint ticket of some sort, then it would generate an enormous number of pairings. A retired union official with a local business owner. We've been at each other's throats for years, but we're getting behind this candidate who or this ticket that exemplifies these values of what I believe is effectively a radical center for civil liberties, against the warfare state, against entrenched corporate power, for Main Street against Wall Street, against the corporate trade deals, and so on. There's a whole set of issues that the Democratic Party establishment and the Republican Party establishment agree on, and are opposed by much, sometimes a majority of the American public. But because the establishments have in effect divided the American public, they get to call the shots. So it was, Chomsky is not a political strategist. He's a repository of a great deal of information, and has distilled a lot of information that he finds and gets from other people, and that's incredibly valuable. But I don't think that he himself would put himself out as a political strategist per se. I said that, Nader has occasionally adopted this for short periods of time and then sort of let it go. I think that it's been, right now, Vote Pact is just basically, me blogging and trying to, raise up voices of other people who, show some semblance of left-right agreement. And I don't know if, it needs to be broadened with more people or with an advisory board or something like that. But, it's the strategy has never been adopted by a candidate, so it hasn't been meaningfully tried. Even when, Kevin Zeese, for example, a tireless advocate, Green Party activist, who I have some differences with, but like virtually everybody I'm discussing here, admiration for as well, he once got the Green Party and the Libertarian Party nominations when I believe he was running for Senate years ago in Maryland. Even he wouldn't adopt it, even though he was structurally perfectly suited for it. So it's a hard thing to do, I suppose, but I think that it is an idea that is critically important and could really upend the establishment, especially if a right candidate or candidates can be found, and especially if the DNC, as it may well do, again, rigs the primary system to its favorite establishment candidates, whether that's Joe Biden or somebody else.
And it seems clear this recent scuffle between Warren and Sanders over whether he said that a woman could win in 2020 might have had some intervention from the DNC already.
Yeah, I'm sure the Biden camp was popping the champagne bottles. I've been critical of Warren for years. I questioned her on her foreign policy stances when she was at the press club a little over a year ago. I certainly think we should criticize her and Sanders. He's done a lot of stuff especially on foreign policy, that I think is damaging, and I do believe he's gotten better, but that is certainly in his history. But I think that the Biden camp was popping the champagne bottles when you had Warren and Sanders, fighting it out like that.
So one of the kind of discussion points that we previously talked about, and I think it's worth elaborating on, is how this letter from this group included mention of DSA, and one could even talk about wider activism that sprang up in the last 4 years.
Right, and I think you had a great point about that, because the letter says, contrary, rather than the Green Party growing, we've seen DSA growing, and I think you had a great point about that.
Right. DSA only grew the week after Trump got elected, and it never would have grown the way it has had there not been an election of Trump.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that dynamic. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of somewhat related to what the late great Green Party activist group Bruce Dixon would call sheepdogging. That is, to what extent, does the DSA / AOC and the squad apparatus simply keep people in the Democratic Party camp, although they never really get to call the policy, right? So, the policy is dictated by Schumer and Hoyer and Pelosi, but you have all of these activists and activist energy, in effect, staying in the Democratic Party because they somehow feel attuned to it because of the squad, and that it's very dangerous. I mean, it's possible that these handful of members could eventually take over the Democratic Party, but we're a very long way away from there. So I think it needs to be done very cautiously. And the Democratic Party, through its apparatus on MSNBC, is brilliantly, with the whole Russiagate narrative and all of that, you vote for Democrats, and then the Democrats end up spending all of their time pretending that the most dangerous thing in the world is Vladimir Putin rather than the U.S. government. That's who ultimately rules Democratic Party policy and how it colludes with the right wing. So it's really dangerous, I think, and I'm not sure that DSA understands or acknowledges just that. You might know better than I.
From what I gather, that it is in the midst of an identity crisis that is monumental and perhaps not matched by any other identity crisis of a mainstream political party in 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, the two ways to really make a systemic change here is to either reorient the political spectrum, which is with the Vote Pact solution, or to globalize democratic action. Sanders hints at both, right? He can appeal to working class Trump supporters on trade and income inequality issues, and he talks about the Scandinavian democratic socialist so-called model. Of course, Sanders in a lot of ways isn't really a socialist, just like he's not really anti-war, but he perhaps might open the door to those things. But his he's opening the door to a globalization or a political realignment, but those are the two levers that you want to pull to really change the U.S. political system. And simply calcifying the current duopoly without opening up the U.S. political system to be more aligned with the rest of the world in some meaningful way is very dangerous, and that's where we are. That's where we are, in part because of the Russian xenophobia, because there are so many flavors of xenophobia in the U.S. political system, and there isn't sufficient action to alter them. There's no, there's some climate action but there's no, February 15th, 2003, where you had global protests against the Iraq War. There's no movement like that right now.
Right.
And without a movement like that, or a left-right populist political reorientation, the prospects are very dim. And again, Sanders hints at both of them, but it's a twinkle. It's not lightning. It's a lightning bug right now.
Right.
And so I'm afraid that Sanders is enough to keep people on the Democratic Party ranch without actually producing anything. That's the fear. He had a much stronger candidate in some ways, Corbyn, and he lost badly in the UK because he didn't know how to fight back, and it's not clear that Sanders does either.
I don't want to make it sound like I'm celebrating that Trump got elected in 2016, because I'm quite actively opposed to everything he does and do a lot of struggling alongside people who do, but it's also an objective fact that Bernie Sanders would not have dared primary Hillary Clinton if she had been elected in 2016 in the way that Teddy Kennedy went after Jimmy Carter, or before that, Reagan went against Gerald Ford in 1976.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair bet. I mean, it's a little open to question depending on what she did. Which version of Hillary we got. I mean, if she actually escalated the war in Syria, for example, or if she pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, or if she actually moved to privatize Social Security or something like that, then one would hope that there would have been some faction on the progressive end of the Democratic Party that would have ran against her. But I really doubt that Sanders would have done it.
What are some further thoughts that you have in regards to this election, the Vote Pact strategy, or other components of it that you think merit conversation?
The system wants people to debate minutia that has nothing to do with their lives. What did Giuliani do about the Ukraine with the phone call? And you're supposed to be arguing, if you have any interaction with a Trump supporter, that's what you're supposed to be arguing with them about. And the system wants you and them to fight to the death. Almost literally, figuratively. They want you to fight and fight and fight about that and unfriend each other and never talk and say, hold on. Both the Democratic Party establishment and the Republican Party establishment are backed by a lot of the same companies, a lot of the same corporations, and they're for the same wars. And, we're supposed to be on this team or that team based on, some substance, but a lot of rhetoric. And no, we actually should figure out what we agree on and figure out how we can best pursue what we agree on. And Vote Pact is a very tangible way to manifest that. That is, a progressive teams up with a conservative, and they both vote for the independent or third-party candidates that they most believe in, and they unlock the shackles that have hindered them from doing so. The hatred that binds them to the Democratic Party because they hate Trump, or the Republican Party because they hate somebody like Hillary Clinton.
You did a lot of research in formulating this strategy, and I was wondering if you could describe some of it.
Right. There's an excellent book called Gaming the Vote by William Poundstone that talks about different voting systems. I highly recommend it. It goes through ranked choice voting, which a lot of people know stuff about, as well as score voting, which is a bit more complicated, but in some instances is better. and I came up with the idea years and years and years ago, but it was interesting to see how it correlated to how different people who have approached voting in a more methodical way, and it uses the current system of very simple voting, what's called one past the post, first past the post, to effectively replicate a much better voting system. Those better voting systems are going to be very hard to implement with the current establishment, Democratic and Republican candidates or incumbents. They might, if people started doing Vote Pact, they might actually implement those reforms, because nothing gets the establishment to do something than people doing it for themselves. Once the Black Panthers, had their breakfast programs, the DC insiders got up off their butts and provided, and started Head Start to provide breakfast programs for poor kids. I think that's part of the dynamic. But another part of the dynamic is, polling and how it's done. The Commission on Presidential Debates says that they are interested in who people want to be president. But that's not the polls that they rely on. The polls that they rely on, their wording is, if the election were held today, a false hypothetical, who would you vote for? And all that does is calcify the problems of the voting system. That is, a lot of people might want a third-party candidate to be president, but feel constricted to say that they will vote for either the Democratic or Republican because they hate and fear the other one. So the system effectively blocks out a meaningful measure of actual public preference. I believe that the group Fair Vote is starting to do the first ever, that I know of, scientific ranked choice voting polls. That is to poll people in the Democratic primary of who do you want to be president. Actually, I think that they ask who do you want to be the nominee, which I think is a flawed question. It should be who you want to be president, and then ranking 1, 2, 3, 4. Sanders, Biden, whoever the Warren, etc. So polling, in effect, aggravates the problem the way that it's been done so far, because it's not asking in a real voter preference. It's simply echoing the bind that people are in terms of which of the candidates they will vote for, or if the election held today, which you would vote for. It just simply aggravates the current bind that voters are in, which hides what their actual preferences are.
Right.
So, in the extreme example, you could have a third-party candidate who would have a majority of public support, but you'd never know it, because it's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma, because the public is never asked the relevant question. It's unlikely, but it's a theoretical possibility in the current structure. You could imagine in the 2004 or in the 2000 election, if they were actually asking people who you want to be president. I actually got money to do one poll in 2004, and Nader's numbers doubled. He went, at his height, he was like at 4% or something, and when I did this poll, he jumped to 8% or something like that. Well, if that got reported, then there would be a feedback mechanism, and somebody like Nader would get more and more support. if you had, a polling mechanism and a media mechanism to highlight that there is actually public preference for a candidate like that. We're a long way away from that because there's nobody running on an independent ticket with, the name recognition that Nader had in 2000. But right now, the structure for that isn't even there yet. Right now, the only apparent structure for meaningful shift is Sanders, but that leaves it largely at the mercy of the DNC, and that's a very tall order to overcome.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.